President Trump has set a new deadline for Iran, and at the same time, Israel has passed one of the most controversial laws of this conflict so far, a measure making the death penalty the default sentence for Palestinians convicted in military courts of deadly attacks. These are two separate developments, but together they tell you something important about where the region is heading. On one side, the risk of a wider war with Iran is rising fast. On the other, the legal and political framework governing Palestinians is becoming even harsher. If you want to understand the pressure building across the Middle East right now, these are the two stories you have to watch together. Let's start with Trump's new deadline because the timing here is critical. According to the Associated Press, Trump gave Iran 48 hours to open the Strait of Hormuz as the search continued for a missing U.S. pilot. Al Jazeera similarly reported that Trump said severe retaliation would follow if Hormuz was not reopened by Monday, and it also said Trump gave Iran 48 hours to make a deal as the search for the missing U.S. pilot continued. The New York Times reported that the United States was still searching for a missing crew member while Trump repeated threats over the strait. Across outlets, the wording varies, but the core fact is consistent. The White House has publicly tied a very short deadline to one of the world's most strategic waterways and to an active military crisis involving a downed U.S. aircraft. That aircraft incident matters a lot. AP reports that 2 U.S. aircraft were shot down as the war in Iran escalated, with at least one crew member missing. AP also notes that these are the first U.S. military jets shot down by enemy fire in more than 20 years. That statistic is significant not just militarily, but politically. It means this is not a routine confrontation or a symbolic exchange. This is a conflict serious enough to produce losses the U.S. military has not seen from enemy fire in 2 decades. The New York Times adds that the missing crew member raises concern because Iran has repeatedly used detained foreigners as leverage since 1979. So the deadline is not only about shipping lanes. It is unfolding under pressure from a human rescue and hostage risk dimension as well. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow but enormously important waterway between Iran and Oman. It carries a substantial share of the world's oil and gas shipments. That is why the threat to Hormuz is bigger than the region itself. Even people thousands of miles away feel it through fuel prices, shipping costs, inflation, and market volatility. AP highlights that French and South Korean leaders say they will work together on the Strait of Hormuz. That tells you the problem is not being treated as an abstract regional issue. It is already drawing in other governments because the economic consequences can spread quickly. Reuters and AP both connect the broader Iran war to energy concerns, and AP separately reports that European ministers are calling for profit caps on energy companies as the war drives prices higher. The military environment around this deadline is also highly active. On the official U.S. side, CENTCOM has issued multiple public releases tied to Operation Epic Fury. On March 4th, CENTCOM posted that the USS Thomas Hudner fired Tomahawk land attack missiles in support of Operation Epic Fury. On March 8th, it issued a Central Command update and a warning to civilians in Iran. On March 11th, CENTCOM warned civilians to avoid ports used by Iranian forces. And on March 31st, CENTCOM specifically refuted media claims of U.S. strikes in Lamurd, Iran. That last point is important because it shows why sourcing matters in a war environment. Some claims circulate quickly, but official confirmation or denial can change the factual picture. If you are trying to stay grounded, you have to separate what is confirmed from what is merely repeated. Trump's deadline is being delivered into this exact atmosphere. Active operations, aircraft losses, missing personnel, and a globally important shipping choke point. That is why the rhetoric is landing so heavily. It compresses time and raises the pressure on both sides. If Iran does not move, then Washington faces pressure to follow through. If Washington follows through, then Tehran faces pressure to respond. That is the logic of escalation, and it can move faster than diplomacy. Now turn to the second development because it is no less consequential. Reuters reports that Israel's parliament passed a law on March 30th, making death by hanging the default sentence for Palestinians convicted in military courts of deadly attacks. Reuters separately says the law fulfills a pledge by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's far-right allies. This is not being described as a rare or exceptional penalty. Reuters' wording is specific. It becomes the default sentence in those military court cases. That is what triggered immediate international criticism. According to Reuters, the United Nations rights chief said the law violates international humanitarian law and urged Israel to repeal it. Reuters also reports that the European Union called the decision very concerning. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez went further, calling it a step towards apartheid. 8 Muslim-majority countries also condemned the law, according to Reuters. These are not isolated objections from activists alone. They include the UN, the EU, a major European government, and a group of Muslim-majority states. That breadth of reaction signals how sensitive and far-reaching this legal change is seen to be. Reuters also reports on the fear this law has generated among Palestinians. In one dispatch, jailed Palestinians' relatives in the occupied West Bank said they feared their relatives could be hanged without due process under the new law. That detail matters because it shows the law is not only a diplomatic issue, it is producing immediate anxiety among families who believe the legal system they face is already unequal and will now become even more punitive. To understand why this law is so controversial, you have to look at the legal structure it sits inside. Reuters says the law applies to Palestinians convicted in military courts. Military courts in occupied territory are already heavily criticized by rights groups and international bodies, especially when compared with civilian legal processes applied elsewhere. When the punishment inside that system becomes death by hanging as the default sentence, critics argue that the risk of irreversible injustice becomes much more serious. That is the central concern running through the UN and EU reactions. This legal shift is happening while violence continues despite a ceasefire framework that Reuters says is more than 5 months old. Reuters reports that Israeli fire killed 6 in Gaza and the West Bank on March 30th, that airstrikes killed at least 6 in Gaza on March 31st, and that Israeli strikes on March 29 hit 2 Gaza police checkpoints and killed at least 6 people, including a child, according to local health officials. Reuters also reports that on March 28th, Israeli forces killed a 15-year-old Palestinian boy near Bethlehem, citing the Palestinian Health Ministry. And just hours ago, Reuters reported that Israeli fire killed 4 Palestinians in Gaza, according to medics. The point here is not to merge every incident into one story, but to show the environment in which the death penalty law is landing, a ceasefire that remains fragile, recurring deadly violence, and deep distrust on all sides. There is also a wider humanitarian backdrop that cannot be ignored. Reuters reports that the head of UNRWA is seeking an investigation into the killing of more than 390 employees in the 2-year Gaza war. Describing it as the deadliest conflict in the UN body's history, more than 390 UNRWA staff killed is a striking figure. Whatever position people take on the broader politics, that number shows the scale of danger and destruction in Gaza. Reuters also published a deeply human story on April 1st about babies evacuated from Gaza 2 years earlier returning to their parents for the first time. They had never known their parents and had never known Gaza. That is the human landscape behind the policy headlines. The legal and military stories also intersect politically through Trump's Gaza diplomacy. Reuters reports that Hamas has said disarmament calls are unacceptable before Israel fully implements the first phase of the U.S.-brokered Gaza ceasefire. Reuters also reported on April 2nd that Hamas wants guarantees of full Israeli troop withdrawal before disarmament talks begin. And on March 27th, Reuters said the Trump Board of Peace plan would disarm Hamas in stages over 8 months and require destruction of Gaza's tunnel network. So while Trump is publicly issuing deadlines to Iran, his administration is also trying to shape Gaza's political future. Meanwhile, Israel is tightening punitive measures through domestic legislation. These are not disconnected tracks. They are overlapping pressures in the same regional system. Now here is where the bigger picture comes into focus. Trump's deadline for Iran is about deterrence and leverage. Israel's death penalty law is about domestic politics, punishment, and control under occupation. But both developments share one feature. They reduce the room for compromise. A public countdown is hard to soften without appearing weak. A law framed as default punishment is hard to reconcile with arguments for restraint and equal justice. In practical terms, each side is making moves that raise costs and narrow exits. That is one reason retention in this story matters. What happens next may depend on whether these developments are read as bargaining tools or as new permanent realities. If Trump's deadline is primarily coercive diplomacy, there may still be a path to de-escalation through back channels. If it becomes a credibility trap, military escalation becomes more likely. If Israel's death penalty law remains mostly symbolic or is blocked in implementation, its practical effect may be limited. If it is actively enforced, it could deepen international isolation and inflame tensions across the Palestinian territories and beyond. The reactions already suggest serious consequences either way. Reuters says 8 Muslim-majority countries condemned the law. The EU called it very concerning. The UN said it violates international law. Spain called it a step toward apartheid. Those are unusually sharp responses centered on a legal measure, not a single battlefield incident. That tells you many international actors see this not as a narrow security tool, but as a significant change in the governing logic of the conflict. Meanwhile, on the Iran side, AP reports that Trump's go-it-alone certainty is colliding with the uncertainties of war. The New York Times similarly says Trump pledged a quick end to the war in Iran but has not explained how. That is another pressure point. Strong rhetoric can rally support in the short term, but if events on the ground remain unpredictable, that same rhetoric can amplify scrutiny. A deadline is a promise of consequences. If the consequences do not materialize, credibility can suffer. If they do materialize and the conflict widens, the costs can rise fast. There is also a public mood dimension worth noting. Al Jazeera reports that protesters in Tel Aviv rallied with the message, "Don't bomb, talk." That small detail matters because it shows public pressure for diplomacy exists even inside a country facing missile threats. At the same time, Reuters has chronicled how years of conflict have hardened politics across the region. The result is a tense mix: leaders escalating, institutions warning, families grieving, and parts of the public still demanding talks. For viewers trying to stay factual, here are the most solid verified points from the sources. First, AP, Al Jazeera, and the New York Times all indicate Trump has set a short new deadline linked to Hormuz and the search for a missing U.S. crew member. Second, AP confirms 2 U.S. aircraft have been shot down in the Iran war, with at least 1 crew member missing, and says these are the first U.S. jets shot down by enemy fire in over 20 years. Third, CENTCOM confirms ongoing U.S. military activity under Operation Epic Fury and has issued both operational updates and civilian warnings. Fourth, Reuters confirms Israel passed a law making death by hanging the default sentence for Palestinians convicted in military courts of deadly attacks. Fifth, Reuters confirms that the UN, EU, Spain, and 8 Muslim-majority countries strongly criticize that law. Sixth, Reuters confirms that more than 390 UNRWA employees were killed in the 2-year Gaza war, according to the UNRWA head. What we should avoid saying, because the supplied sources do not fully confirm it, is that any one next move is guaranteed. The exact military response if Trump's deadline expires is not verified. The exact implementation path of Israel's new death penalty law is also not fully laid out in these source excerpts. Being careful about that is not weakness. It is how fact-based reporting stays trustworthy. So where does this leave us? In a region already destabilized by war, 2 new signals have arrived almost at once. Trump is telling Iran the clock is running out over Hormuz and a missing American airman. Israel is telling Palestinians and the world that military court convictions for deadly attacks may now carry a default death sentence by hanging. Both messages are designed to project resolve. Both are being read internationally as escalation. And both arrive in a context where diplomacy is weak, violence is continuing, and humanitarian suffering remains immense. If you zoom out, this brief is really about a narrowing of options. The military front with Iran is growing more dangerous. The legal front in Israel and the Palestinian territories is becoming more punitive. The diplomatic front is more fragmented than ever, and the civilian cost keeps rising in the background, whether through deaths in Gaza, fear among prisoners' families in the West Bank, or the global economic stress tied to energy and trade routes. That is why these 2 headlines belong together. Trump's new deadline and Israel's new law are not random parallel stories. They are signs of a broader moment in which pressure, punishment, and urgency are overtaking compromise. Whether that produces deterrence, deeper conflict, or some unstable mix of both is the question hanging over the region right now. For now, the facts are clear enough. The deadline is real, the law is passed, the criticism is intense, the stakes are rising, and the next moves, whether military, legal, or diplomatic, will matter far beyond the Middle East.